Presented by Caltech.
It is indeed a great honor for me to introduce to you tonight's speaker, a distinguished scientist, and I'm proud to say my colleague at JPL. Carol Raymond joined JPL 26 years ago after receiving a PhD in geophysics from Columbia University. Her research took a long arc all the way from the ocean floor on the Earth, through Antarctica, to Mars and beyond into the asteroid belt. Carol led 5 scientific expeditions to Antarctica, 2 of them on icebreakers, and she logged more than 500 hours on a Navy P-3 Orion aircraft while she was doing magnetic and gravity surveying of the Weddell Sea off of Antarctica. She actually surveyed the area where Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, got trapped and later on crashed by the ice. Dr. Raymond has more than 135 publications, and get this, all the way from the Earth's tectonics to ice sheet history to magnetic fields on the Earth and Mars, numerous mission studies in different types, and the character and evolution of the asteroids Vesta and Ceres, which we will be talking about tonight. In 2002, Carol became a principal scientist at JPL in recognition of her many scientific accomplishments. She also then took on her current role as the deputy principal investigator and project scientist of the Dawn discovery mission that went to the asteroids Vesta and Ceres. Now, Dawn, as Carol will undoubtedly explain to you, is the only satellite ever to be launched from the Earth that went into orbit around 2 different objects in our solar system. Now, Carol currently spends her time analyzing that fascinating data from Vesta and Ceres, and she also manages the Small Bodies Program Office in the Solar System Exploration Directorate at JPL. She has received numerous awards in her scientific career, including 2 Exceptional Achievement Medals from NASA, the Antarctic Service Medal, and she's also a fellow of the Geological Society of America. She served on numerous advisory committees for JPL, the American Geophysical Union, the National Science Foundation, and NASA. What can I say? She's an extremely accomplished scientist. Now, in 2014, the asteroid 10724, and there'll be a test afterwards to see if you can remember that, was named Carol Raymond to honor Carol's work on the Dawn mission. Now, fittingly, that asteroid is called a Vestoid. It is actually part of Vesta. So, without further delay, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you my esteemed colleague, Dr. Carol Raymond.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey tonight, and we're going to discuss the targets of the Dawn mission, and the topic that I want to spend most of the time on is new data from the dwarf planet Ceres, and asking and answering the question whether Ceres is an ancient ocean world. So the cover art here on this slide is actually an image of Ceres. It's enhanced color, but it is based on the data that Dawn has collected. And over here is the Dawn spacecraft, and you'll notice a couple of things about it. It has a very large solar array, 2 solar wings. And they collect sunlight to produce lots of power. And that power is used to ionize xenon gas, which is in a tank in the spacecraft. And then the xenon ions are released, and they are accelerated through a grid. And as each ion leaves the spacecraft, it imparts a tiny little force. And the sum total of that force on the spacecraft at any one point is about as much as a piece of paper sitting on your hand. But as that force builds over time, the spacecraft turns into a very high-speed object. And it has taken us places that we could only have dreamed of going literally decades ago. So this is a very futuristic mission and one that's been hugely scientifically productive. So tonight we're going to find out what protoplanets like Vesta and Ceres can tell us about the history of our solar system. And we're going to examine Ceres and ponder the questions of where and when it formed, and whether it had a subsurface ocean. And then also, is it active today? What is it like today? So we'll start at the beginning. Our solar system began when a supernova explosion nearby compressed a cloud of gas and dust into a nebula, which eventually formed our star. And from the nebular materials, the gas and the dust, planetesimals began to accrete, and then they grew into protoplanets. And then finally, we ended up with the planets that we see today. And one of the consequences of that supernova was that a lot of short-lived radioactive material was seeded into the nebula. So here's a rendition of this swirling nebula of gas and dust and these planetesimals which are forming. The sun the star forms and starts to clear out the dust and gas nearby. And the farther out we go in the solar system, at that point, the colder it gets and the higher the concentration of ice. So questions that we're interested in knowing is whether there were chemical variations in the nebular disk, whether the time at which planetesimals formed affected the outcome of the planets, and then what processes mixed the material after it was formed, such that we can explain the diversity of the objects that we see in our solar system today. So this pertains to some big questions, like is our water-rich planet unique? As you remember from the picture of the sun clearing out the gas and dust, the area in the inner solar system is very dry. The planets, Mars is dry, Mercury is dry, but the Earth is not. And so the question is, where did the Earth get its water? And where and when then in the solar system were the conditions for life met early in history? Because eventually, if we had life forming in many places in the solar system, then the chances that it would migrate from one object to another increases, and therefore we can try to get better understanding of the question of how life arose on the Earth. So that's kind of a tall order. We'll take a stab at it, and we're going to start with examining some major events in the solar system formation. So time zero, 4.567 to 4.568, roughly, billion years ago, when the first solids started to condense out of that nebular disk. And the first solids were these tiny little calcium aluminum droplets. And then iron also began to condense into the first iron meteorites. I say iron meteorites because they've come to the Earth, we've examined them, and we know that they were very early forming. Now, just a few million years later, by 3 million years after those first solids, we know that Vesta formed. And that's why we say Vesta truly is a fossil from the early solar system. And then Jupiter formed shortly thereafter. And of course, Jupiter is a gas giant. It grew quickly and then started to control the environment nearby. And it changed the area of the asteroid belt from one in which bodies were accreting to a collisional environment that scattered material widely. And then finally, the terrestrial planets formed between about 10 and 30 million years after the solar system first solids. Now, we also know that about 500 million years after the solar system, time zero, there was a cataclysmic event in which material came raining down on the inner solar system. And we know this from the bombardment record of the moon and the fact that we've obtained lunar samples, we take them in the lab, we measure the ages, so we can actually date when this happened. And we also can take the cratering record of the moon, and we can look at other bodies and compare their apparent age relative to this bombardment process. And we find that it's a very widespread cataclysmic event, which is termed the late heavy bombardment. And now models have been created to explain this as a result of interactions between the giant planets which were forming in the outer solar system. So just to get you situated, a little bit of a schematic of the solar system. This is on a logarithmic scale. So each of these is a factor of 10. So we see Saturn is 10 times as far from the sun as the Earth. And here is the edge of our solar system at about 100 times that distance. And we see that the asteroid belt, the main asteroid belt, is located between Mars and Jupiter. And then there's another large belt of material called the Kuiper belt. And these are much more primitive, cold objects, which were part of the original material that the planets were forming from. But they generally stayed much colder and sequestered out in the edges of the solar system. And then further out, we have the Oort cloud, which looks in this view as if it's following this same sort of ring structure, but it's actually a sphere around our solar system of material that's been basically ejected from our solar system and is now in this large halo. So we'll be touching on some of these features as we go along. Okay, so now a little bit about the Dawn mission. It is a journey in space and time because we are going out in space to go back in time and investigate the conditions and the processes that were occurring at the dawn of the solar system. And that is why it's called the Dawn mission. And I've told you that its targets are Vesta and Ceres. They're also the most massive objects in the main asteroid belt. And then to give you a few mission facts, we were selected in 2001. And so I've been at this for now 15 years, from the time the proposal was written and selected to going through the implementation phase, launching, and getting all the great science. And this was selected from a mission competition and is led by Professor Chris Russell at UCLA. Now, it's also a collaboration of many partners, and I always like to give a shout out to the partners because it's the reason we can do such a great mission for such a low cost. So we've had contributions from the Italian Space Agency and the German Aerospace Center. They've given us instruments, which I'll show you in a moment. And then, of course, it's a NASA-funded mission. Now, as I said before, we're going to look at these two fossils, and we're going really deep into the heart of the main asteroid belt. And this is quite a distance from Mars, so it's really quite far out. So getting to know Vesta and Ceres a little better, these are two images that were taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. So right now, the Hubble Space Telescope is about the most powerful instrument we have to peer into the solar system and look for interesting objects. So we looked at both Vesta and Ceres with Hubble, and you can see that you can make out a few things about them, but not much. And then up here, I've given you their diameters. So Vesta at 570 kilometers is quite large. It's also quite dense. And Ceres is much larger. It's the largest object, but it's rather lighter. Now, where are they exactly? Now you're looking down on the ecliptic plane. You see the orbits of the planets, Earth, Mercury, Mars. And these two yellow and green rings are the orbits of Vesta and Ceres. And you can see they're a little bit more eccentric. They're not quite as circular as the planetary orbits. And here's the orbit of Jupiter. So the main asteroid belt exists here between Mars and Jupiter. And Ceres and Vesta are basically in the heart of the belt, but Vesta stays a little bit closer to Mars, and Ceres gets a little bit farther away. Now, Dawn launched in 2007, and it was very poetic that was exactly 200 years from when from when Ceres was first discovered. It was discovered by an Italian in Palermo, Sicily, and he thought initially it was a comet, but found out later on that it was actually what was called then a minor planet. And so 200 years after it was first discovered, we launched a spacecraft to go rendezvous with it and find out what it was. I think that was quite an achievement. So we launched at dawn from Cape Canaveral, and then off we went to the asteroid belt. And it takes quite a bit of time using the ion propulsion, but you also can get places, as I said before, that you couldn't otherwise. So the fuel that we took on the spacecraft gave us as much thrust as that rocket gave us to get out of the Earth's gravity well, to get off the Earth. And so we've been using that and ionizing this xenon gas and then basically puffing all the way through the solar system. It took us about 3 years to get to Vesta. We used a Mars gravity assist, and then we spent 15 months at Vesta in orbit, examining it closely. And then we left and we took 3 years to get to Ceres. And we carried some very capable instruments. We call them instruments when they're on spacecraft. They don't make music, but they take scientific measurements. And we have 2 cameras from the German Aerospace Center. We have a gamma-ray neutron detector from Los Alamos. And we have a visible infrared spectrometer from the Italian Space Agency. And as you can see, these are very beautiful and elegant, highly crafted instruments, and they're very precise. And I'll be talking a little bit today about the data from this spectrometer. Now, this is an animation to show you how Dawn moved through the solar system. Here we've launched from the Earth, and you can see by the blue glow that we were thrusting with the ion propulsion. We came in, we basically fell back into Mars orbit, got a gravity assist to fling us out and catch up with Vesta. And then we had to basically match orbits with Vesta. And then we stayed there, as I said, for 15 months, and we took lots of measurements. And you can see Ceres, meanwhile, has been lapping Vesta. So off we go. We leave Vesta, and we push out to get to Ceres. We match its orbit, and then finally, we slow down and we get captured. And that's where we are now, after we got there March of 2015. So we've been gathering some fantastic data since then. And here you can just see that the orbits of these asteroids are a little bit inclined relative to the plane of the planets. Okay, so what are they made of? The interesting thing about Vesta and Ceres is we think that they formed very, very early, but they're really very different. So they're kind of like siblings that took, very different paths through life. And Vesta, which you can see here in this picture, is very rocky, dry, very bright. It's a lot like the moon. It has an iron core, mantle, and crust. Ceres is icy, wet, and dark, and we expected before we got there for it to have a rocky core, an icy mantle, and a dusty clay surface. So here I'm showing you this is the Vesta that we mapped, just a beautiful object, somewhat irregular, but still looking very planet-like. And here are other asteroids which have been visited by spacecraft. And you may be familiar with Eros. There was a whole mission to Eros called NEAR. A couple of the asteroids that were flown by on the way to other places. But you can see that Vesta is very different from those other asteroids. And so we don't, even though it's called an asteroid, we like to call it a protoplanet because it really is an intact object that it was forming out of the little planetesimals. It got to the point of being a protoplanet, it had planetary processes, and then it's remained intact since that point. So that's a very compelling place to visit. Ceres, on the other hand, is a dwarf planet, and it is, as you can see, does not look at all like any of these. We're going to be looking at it in much more detail, but I think you get the point now that these two objects really are special. Now, one of the reasons that Vesta also is really special is that we have a lot of pieces of it right here on the Earth. And as you heard from Jakob before, there are asteroids called Vestoids that are orbiting as a family with Vesta. And they happen to cross through what's called a resonance. It's basically kind of like a little wormhole. And if they get in there, they are sent on Earth-crossing orbits. And then they'll end up streaking through our atmosphere, falling to the ground, and being collected. And so here are two of my colleagues from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And they are examining pieces of Vesta, these two pieces here, and also out collecting. So these meteorites really tell us a lot of information about a body if we can know which body they came from. In the case of Vesta, there's a unique spectral fingerprint, kind of like it is like a fingerprint, and we can match meteorites to Vesta. So we already knew quite a bit about Vesta. But here I'm showing you one of Vesta's most spectacular features. We're looking into a giant impact basin in the southern hemisphere, and it has a very large mountain in it. And here you see the whole southern hemisphere laid out flat, and that basin is almost the size of the whole southern hemisphere. It's a planetary scale feature, and if it were on Earth at the same size, it would be stretching from Washington to Tokyo across the North Pole. So this is one of the largest mountains and one of the biggest craters we've seen on a planetary body to scale. And we also have determined that this impact was a source of Vesta's family. So all that material that blew off of Vesta is co-orbiting with it, and those smaller things can drift because of the forces from the solar radiation pressure, things like that, and so they can drift into these Earth-crossing orbits. So we'd have more pieces of Vesta on the Earth than we have meteorites from the Moon or Mars combined. So we do know quite a bit about Vesta. So we went there in part to say, is Vesta the parent body of all of these meteorites? And if so, is the picture that we built from analyzing those rocks in the lab correct? And then if it's correct, we learn a great deal because we validated what we could find out from those rocks. And what we found was, yes, Vesta is the parent body of those meteorites. And yes, Vesta does have an iron core, has a mantle and a basaltic crust. And that is important because it says that Vesta got hot enough to melt. And it got hot enough because it had some of that radioactive material that was available in the very, very beginning of our nebula when the solids started to form. So we know that Vesta is very, very old, and it's from the very beginning. So having discovered, I gave you just a very brief overview of Vesta because we're going to move on to Ceres, but I invite you to go look for yourself at some of the other very interesting results that we've gotten at Vesta. Now, so back to Ceres. This is what it looked like from the Hubble Space Telescope 2004. And we knew from its shape and the way it tugs on other bodies nearby, that it was much lighter than a rock. And the density is about equivalent to 30% water ice, 70% rock. And its shape, because if you've ever played with one of those like liquid-filled balls, as it spins and it flattens out. So a rotating body, you can tell from its shape how viscous or fluid it is in the center. So we knew that Ceres had a yielding center. It had something more water-rich inside. And that made it really interesting because water is one of the essential ingredients for life. And that made Ceres an object of not just passing interest, but really interest in terms of astrobiology. And just to, I'm going to give you a few vocabulary words perhaps, or etymological origins. And Ceres comes from the name of the Roman goddess of agriculture. And so all the names on Ceres that we've chosen follow the theme of being deities of the harvest or festivals of the harvest. And we have names from all cultures. So this has been a lot of fun to collect those names and apply them to the features on Ceres. Okay, so you should be well familiar now with all these other bullet points on the slide. Now it got even more interesting as we were heading from Vesta to Ceres. Some scientists took data using the Herschel Space Observatory in 2012, and they used a very sensitive instrument to look at the constituents, or the gases near Ceres, and they found a fingerprint of water vapor. And so this, it stimulated somebody to make this graphic of what Ceres might look like after Enceladus. It looks a lot like what we've seen Enceladus to be like. And the question was, well, Ceres has all this water. Could it possibly be outgassing right now? Could there be plumes of material coming off the surface? And if so, that would be hugely interesting. Okay, so we got there. And this is what we saw initially. This is just the images. So that's, taking data with the camera, kind of black and white. And what's really stands out is, of course, that there's some very, very bright material on the surface. And these are the famous bright spots. But you can see there's other places where there's very bright material, and some of it in near impact craters. But also, what we saw was there's a lot of craters. There's a lot of rough topography. So remember I said we expected it to be icy, like an ice mantle over some rock. And if it were icy, then if a crater hit, the ice would be warm enough that over time it would flow and it would erase the crater. So we really did have an expectation that Ceres might be very smooth. And when we saw this, it was like, wow, how do we explain this? And that was really exciting to me because that was the particular science problem that I was interested in. So now this is the same imagery, but now we've got the surface color-coded in terms of its topography. And the red is high standing, and the blue is low standing. And you can see also that Ceres has a lot of topography. It's 15 kilometers from the lowest point to the highest point. So it's a very diverse surface, lots of craters, topographic features, and that says that it's strong. The crust has to be strong in order to support that topography, in order to retain those craters over geologic time. So it's another way to look at the topography, is now just spread out in a map version. And you can see there's some really interesting features like this crater, which has a very subtle crater rim. Then we have the highland here where we have the crater that hosts the very brightest material. And then we generally have some very broad lowlands, broad highlands, et cetera. So we knew that there's not a lot of ice at the surface, because that's what the surface is telling us. And then we could also look at the gravity data. And so based on what we would expect the shape to look like, if there were a lot of, if the rock and the ice hadn't separated, versus what the shape would look like if they had, and what the gravitational data would tell us, is that Ceres has separated, the ice has separated from the rock, but it appears that this ice is all mixed up with rock and likely hydrates of salt. So we'll be seeing more about that later, but if you add rock and these hydrated salts to water ice, it makes it very strong. And in a certain limit, it becomes as strong as rock. And so we know now, based on that and some of the other composition data that we have, that we do have this layer, mixed up layer at the surface, and that's being able to hold the craters and all that topography. So we have, the camera has these spectral bands, and we can make these beautiful maps with enhanced color to show you how the colors are varying on the surface. So the colors are very subtle, and Ceres is very dark. It's very, very dark. So all these pictures don't get the impression that you'd see like blazing surface. It's going to look more like carbon. But we can make pictures using the scientific data to enhance areas that have different characteristics. And what you'll notice here is that when you look for the bright material, it's generally associated with bluer slope. And that bluer slope on a planetary surface is usually associated with younger terrains. We also have a large area here, which seems to be a little bit different than the rest. And so we kind of use this to guide ourselves and to understand the geologic history. Now, I'm going to make you look at one chart of squiggly lines because they really tell us something hugely important about Ceres. So I'm going to explain this. This is showing you how much the intensity of the light that's reflected on the surface, reflected from the surface, being entering the instrument, optics. This is the visible infrared spectrometer. And then the wavelength of the light is along here. So this is all in infrared wavelengths. And you can see that there's a deep, deep absorption band. So the intensity drops way down from its background level. And there are also these very specific other bands. So we can take different mineral mixtures and model what that spectrum is made by. And it has a very strong, unique fingerprint of clays. Clay minerals, which are both magnesium-rich and ammonium-rich, and also carbonate minerals. And then most of the rest of it's a very dark material, maybe graphite, maybe magnetite. But the fact that we found these clays was so important because they're produced by the interaction of rock with water. Okay, so we got our first smoking gun. There was water on Ceres interacting with the rock, forming the clays, and that not only that, but that there was ammonia available at that time, and in that process of the alteration of these of the rocks by water, you produce the clays with the ammonia. Ammonia wants to get out of the NH3 phase and get into the clay structure. That's one of the places it likes. So not only did we find that these ammoniated clays were on the surface, but we found that the whole surface was covered with them. So these are magnesium clays, as I said, with the ammonia, and it's almost a purely homogeneous composition across all of Ceres, except for, you can see a few areas. and those are associated with the brightest material. But generally, what this is telling us is that whatever process produced these, it was global, it was pervasive. And that led us to say, this stuff didn't come from elsewhere. It wasn't just splatted on the surface from some impact. It had to have been produced within Ceres and then gotten onto the surface. And I should have pointed out, I'm sorry, that this color shows you the depth of the absorption band. So this was the one I was showing you was really deep. And so this shows you that it's really deep everywhere except for these few places. So now you can look at another band, and it's this 3.1. This is not working so well. But anyway, you can see the little one near 3 microns. And that tells us whether there's more or less ammonia. So it's giving us the band depth. And I'm sorry, I misspoke, so I'm going to correct myself. This is the band center. So this is where exactly that band falls in the spectrum. And then this one tells you how deep it is. And so this band tells us if there's more ammonia, less ammonia. And again, as you can see, there's less ammonia where you have those bright areas, and there's relatively more here. And you recall we saw that in the framing camera data in the visible as well. So we have some basic geologic provinces. You'll notice this, if you remember, this was also kind of a low area, and this generally is the high area, as well as over here. So we have these broad correlations of the composition and the physical nature of the surface. So what is this telling us about where Ceres formed? Ammonia is not stable in the vicinity of Ceres orbit. It's too warm, it sublimates. So to see ammonia on Ceres was really a puzzle, but it had been posited previously because Ceres was so dark and volatile rich that maybe it came from way out in the outer reaches of the solar system from the Kuiper belt that I showed you previously. And maybe it was scattered in, implanted into its present position. So that would be important because then it would tell us more about what the native material of the asteroid belt was when these objects were forming, if we can prove the Ceres doesn't really fit. But there's another option, and that's that instead of Ceres forming way out there and being scattered in, which is kind of difficult to get it into a nice circular orbit, it would also mean that you would have brought other objects like Ceres, and we don't see them. Another option is that you bring smaller pieces, you bring planetesimals. So these could be, boulder size, a few meters, big enough that during their transport, they do not release the ammonia. It's sequestered somewhere in the center. And if you can bring that material, which is kind of drifting in by the drag of the gas in the nebula, then the idea is that you can accumulate enough near Jupiter to allow Ceres to form. And this would have been a very rapid process. So this is something that's called pebble accretion, and it's becoming one of the favored mechanisms for forming planetesimals very quickly. And then, and as a result, the planets form very quickly. And that has implications for how material is distributed throughout the planet-forming region. So right now, we can't necessarily distinguish between these two hypotheses, but this one is, I would say, more than slightly favored because it's dynamically easier to do. So we're holding these two options open, but we're continuing to look for other evidence that might help us. And some of that other evidence is going to be in the asteroid belt itself. And it's to find other objects which have the same kind of fingerprints of ammonia that maybe we just haven't been able to discover yet. Okay, so this was to introduce a video that I'm going to show you next, because the video is pretty complex, and this is not. Now, this is a cartoon illustration of something that's called the NEAS model. And so the NEAS model is, was first published in 2005, so it's a very recent idea. And the idea was that when the orbits of the giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, as those planets are forming and their orbits are evolving, they're basically interacting with each other. Their gravity fields are interacting, and the orbits are pulsing. And that's causing a lot of perturbations. And they go along for a while, and then they get into an unstable situation, and then it causes rearrangement of their orbits, and stuff starts going in every direction. So anything that's small is being affected by these giant planets. And so it's considered a way that you can move a lot of material, these planetesimals, these protoplanets, Kuiper belt objects, out and in during an event, which is to explain the late heavy bombardment that I talked about at the beginning. So I just called it the not so nice model because obviously these inner planets aren't very happy about being pelted. So this is the kind of model that we just talked about that possibly could bring Ceres in from the Kuiper belt. So the animation you're going to see is really cool. This comes from the California Academy of Sciences. You're actually going to see an animation based on the model itself. And it's starting out with all of this stuff, the planetesimals, the star, the planets are forming, and you're going to see the rings of the giant planet orbits. And then you're going to see the material as those orbits are evolving. You're going to see material going in all directions. And there's a voiceover, so I'll just let you listen to that.
If we look at the orbits of the planets and accelerate the passage of time, so 1 million years pass by every 10 seconds, we can watch how the debris cleared. In this simulation, the giant planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, shift their orbits, their gravity influencing each other, as well as the orbits of myriad small objects. The distribution starts out quite flat, but many unlucky asteroids and comets and dwarf planets get kicked out of the solar system entirely. The remaining ones settle into stable orbits that allow them to coexist safely with the planets. But their orbits aren't as flat as the original distribution of objects in the solar system. Instead, they follow trajectories far above and below the plane of the planet's orbits. Today, we see evidence for this dramatic interplanetary transformation in the orbits of the Kuiper belt objects, the tiny icy worlds that inhabit the outer reaches of the solar system.
Okay, so I think you're going to, if you come for the next talk, the next lecture in the series, you'll hear more about those kinds of interactions in the talk about Planet 9. So I think you've got the idea now that material does move around. In addition to ejecting a whole bunch of stuff from the asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt, that material also came inward. And so objects like Ceres would have been moving into the inner solar system, or we expect that they would, and therefore they could have been impacting the Earth. Now, Ceres has a tremendous amount of water, And if it were to impact the Earth sometime in the past, it would have brought lots of water to the Earth. So we expect that these asteroids could be an important source of water on the Earth. Now this is the introduction to answering the question of whether Ceres has a liquid ocean. So I already told you that the surface is telling us that it did, because it's telling us there was all of this water-rock interaction. So then the question is, could it be present today? And this is a kind of a fanciful cutaway view showing this rocky core material, which is fractured and has fluids circulating in it. And at all of the places where the water and rock are interacting, you get these alteration products. And it doesn't have to be at very high temperature. And then we expected that we had a liquid layer, a liquid ocean, and at the top, an ice layer. So if we look at that in a sort of a schematic, here we start out with the rock and the ice all in a very well-mixed state. And then they start to separate, the water starts to separate from the rock and circulate. And that's what we call physical differentiation, when you separate the heavier material towards the core, the lighter material goes to the surface. And here we would expect that we formed a thick ice layer, but at the bottom, because there was so much salt, the salts will go to the bottom, the ice that's forming is very pure, and you end up with a very briny layer down there. And then what happens, you impact the surface, and those impacts carry some heat. They hit the ice, they melt the ice sublimates, and they also can just excavate it from the surface, and off it goes. So we think that over time, most of this pure ice layer has gone away. And what's not gone away has gotten mixed in with the briny residue, frozen brine at the bottom of the ice layer, so that now you have this layer that I talked about before. It's got rock mixed with ice, mixed with salt hydrates. And so that can explain what we're seeing at the surface of Ceres, and it's consistent with this whole sequence in which you had a previous ocean. So, finally, what is it doing today? And what's going on with all this bright material? This is again, enhanced color picture of the Akator crater and the very bright spots. These are kind of overexposed, but they give you a good impression of how bright that is relative to the surroundings. Now here we're looking at it in the clear filter images and a much higher resolution. You're looking down on the crater, and what you see, the crater is very irregular. And the bright material is also very irregular. In the center, it has a kind of a flowing structure where it comes away from the central pit. This is a pit, and there's a mound in the center, and I'll show you that in the next slide. But there's tendrils of this material that seem to have flowed out, and then we have some fractures and auxiliary spots of the bright material. So all of this says that material is very recent because it's so blindingly bright. It's actually brighter than Vesta, which is one of the brightest objects in the asteroid belt. So this is extremely bright. And the crater that it's hosted in is maybe between 50 and 80 million years old. And this material cannot be that old. So that's our first clue. Something's going on. Something's bringing that material to the surface. And so hopefully to answer that, we ask, what is that material? So first, let's look at it close up in another enhanced color photo. Now we're just focused in on that pit. And you can see, hopefully you can see there's fractures circling the pit. And here in the center of the pit, there's a dome. And it's half a kilometer high. This whole pit itself is 10 kilometers across. Sorry, I didn't tell you the crater itself is 90 kilometers. And there's also a different color here on top of the dome, which is another clue that something different is going on there. And you can see this pattern of radial fractures. So, you know, the morphology is very consistent with something that's pushed up from below, it's domed, it's cracked, and it's recent. And that kind of tells us that there's something that's pushing it up from the bottom. So what is the material? As I told you before, these reflectance spectra will tell us exactly what kind of material that is. And these 5 are from these 5 points at distances away from the pit that get smaller. So the 5 is right in the middle, this blue one, and 1 is the background. So we already looked at that. That's that 2.7 band that we looked at before. So look at the size of these bands relative to the background. They're huge, and they have a very different spectrum. And we do the same modeling, and what we find is these are sodium carbonate. And sodium carbonate is also very telltale of alteration in the presence of water. And this is the largest carbonate deposit that we know of outside the Earth, forming in an alkaline environment. And it's similar, the products are similar to Enceladus plume chemistry. In addition to the sodium carbonate, we think, and we're still testing, that there are ammoniated salts, ammonium chloride. So these are really interesting, has really interesting chemistry, and that's really consistent with the stuff that we expect at the base of the ocean. So remember, I showed you before that briny frozen layer, and we think that the ice has mostly been blown off, and so we believe that very shallow in the subsurface are these materials which were formed in the ocean but were sequestered deeply. So we think we're looking sort of through a window to see what they were. Now, there's one other feature which just took everybody by surprise, and we puzzled over it for a while, studied it. It's called the Huna Mons, and Mons means mountain in Latin. So right away, you see that this thing looks like it popped up out of the subsurface. It's got very, very steep flanks, and the stuff at the top is kind of a match for the surrounding terrain. And I'll just point out here on this very high resolution image that this material surrounding it is kind of lapping up on the sides. So that's consistent with it pushing up from below and displacing the material upwards. So some features of Huna. The morphology, we can take that dome structure and model it in terms of what kind of forces and what kind of flow characteristics the material has to take that form. So we find that it's very consistent with extrusion, so something is coming out of the subsurface, a very viscous material, so something that doesn't flow very readily, but it is flowing. And we interpret that to be a briny, salty cryomagma. What is a cryomagma? Cryo means ice, magma means stuff that comes out, so it's basically a flowing ice. And the flanks, we now know the chemistry of the flanks, and where you see the bright streaks, that material is richer in the carbonate, the same kind of chemistry that we saw in the middle of Akator crater. So this is also a clue that we've got that type of material more pervasively on the surface of Ceres, and it is finding its way to the surface in various ways. And this feature is very young, and we think it's less than it's much, I don't know why it says 1 billion years, it's much more recent than that. And so the fact that we see it on the surface now really has implications for Ceres' current and past thermal and chemical evolution. So taken together, these two features and others are telling us that we do still have some liquids in the subsurface. We have to be able to mobilize that material to get it up to the surface. In the case of the Akator crater, it's likely some combination of the impact heat that's set off some convection in the interior, and we're still working out exactly what the physics and chemistry of that is. But clearly the presence of that bright material is associated with the crater itself. In the case of Ahuna Mons, it's not as clear, and therefore we may have cases where just some other more random force, perhaps freezing below, causing expansion, is pushing some residual liquids to the surface. But again, we're still puzzling these things out, and Ceres is really presenting us with some challenges. So finally, we've also seen ample evidence of ice. So I started out saying, you know, where's the ice? We don't see the ice layer's not there. But there is ice. And here, this is a very young crater in the north. And again, our spectrometer is telling us that we have water. Those are water bands. And the red and yellow are showing where those bands are very deep. And then if we come over here, we see that this whole crater wall has collapsed. There's been a big slump down the crater wall, and this very bright stripe there, that is exposed water ice. So the ice is there below the surface. You just need a way to expose it. Once it's exposed, you can detect it, but it will be gone within some period of time that's very geologically short. It could be as soon as 10 years, it could be 100 years, but it's going to sublimate, and then you wouldn't be able to detect it anymore. So the interesting thing is you can calculate that even a small crater, if it exposes water ice in the subsurface, could cause a transient water vapor emission from Ceres, which is consistent with what was seen by the Herschel Space Observatory. So we're also now being able to connect the dots with that observation and posit that these processes are ongoing at Ceres, and likely, you know, there are events which are causing these water vapor, we call it an exosphere, a very tenuous atmosphere, to form, but then it would go away also on a very short time scale. So, kind of like wrap this up with a nice graphic, which is trying to summarize all of the things that the points that I've tried to make here about Ceres evolution. So in the time goes from early on to later, and early on the body was warm from its radioactive heat, and so it did. That's what was driving the Earth, the rock, and the ice to separate. And we had some convection going on, and that was mixing the material, and all of this was giving rise to the conditions for the alteration of which we've seen the products on the surface. Eventually, the body cooled, formed the pure ice layer at the top, and this very salty, briny, frozen layer at the bottom. And then we think that over time, as the surface evolved, that these more localized situations occur with cracks and some pockets of melt, and those are coming to the surface and creating these features that we're studying today. And so here also, on the top, you can see the different chemistry of those processes. So back to the question of water and life, Ceres is a sibling, essentially, of Europa, the moon of Jupiter, and Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, both known to harbor subsurface oceans in the present time. And the reason, of course, is the tidal heating that they undergo. And yet their surface temperatures are very, very low. So we have really frozen, strong ice layers on the surface. But on Ceres, we don't have tidal heating. being much closer to the sun, there's a lot more solar energy available to drive processes on Ceres. And we know now that the ocean has frozen. But back in time, Ceres conditions were very similar to those on Europa and Enceladus. And in fact, as I've said, we see a similar chemistry in the carbonate deposits. So this makes Ceres an interesting object from an astrobiological standpoint, and also an interesting target to return to get to the surface and really examine the materials. So hopefully sometime somebody will do that. Okay, so I'd like to summarize then. Ceres formed very early. The material was quite primitive and ice-rich, similar to the Kuiper Belt objects, but its evolution diverged. The Kuiper Belt objects largely stayed, the ice did not melt, and they didn't undergo all this chemical evolution. So Ceres is, we think, unique in that sense. And it's, we believe now, a frozen ocean world from the dawn of the solar system, and yet appears to be active today. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I would be happy to take some questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, could you please use one of the microphones? Yes.